This is a group of men who have grown rich through secretive energy deals between Egypt and Israel. They have cost the Egyptian people billions of dollars in lost revenues.
So it was obvious that Egypt was being ripped off.
One of the men responsible was a confidant of ex-President Hosni Mubarak.
Did you steal your country's natural resources?
No.
The other, a former Israeli intelligence officer who is now suing the Egyptian state.
How much money will you be satisfied to take from the Egyptians?
I'll settle for 50 billion. Have a good day.
We investigate the role of energy in the most important relationship in the Middle East, Israel's peace accord with Egypt, as a new balance of power emerges in the region.
From the Israeli perspective, it's a game changer because their one great weakness was their energy dependent on others.
Israel has laid claim to some of the largest gas fields discovered this century.
When gas came on stream, they called that their second liberation day.
As gas shortages sweep Egypt, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is hoping that a clandestine deal to buy gas from Israel will secure his political future.
Egypt needs gas, we can sell it. What else can be better?
Since its foundation, Israel's lack of oil and gas has been a key strategic weakness. In the 1960s, it looked to neighboring Egypt.
Egypt has been extracting gas from the waters off its coast since the 1960s. During the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, Israel seized the Sinai Peninsula and a number of oil fields there. This set the stage for this relationship of energy interdependence.
In the 1970s, up to 2/3 of Israel's oil came from land it illegally occupied. As the United States began brokering talks that would lead to the Camp David Accords, the State Department made a secret offer to appease Israel. The U.S. agreed to supply Israel with oil for 5 years if its own supplies are disrupted and it cannot meet its normal requirements.
It was always a factor in the relationship between Egypt and Israel. The Sinai was, and still is, a producer. And when you got the first Camp David, part of the issue was how is that going to work? Will the Egyptians get the oil from the Sinai?
When the Camp David Accords were signed in 1978, Israel agreed to a full withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. The United States formally committed itself to guarantee Israel with energy for a further 15 years.
The U.S. basically bought and has paid significant sums to try to reassure both parties in that agreement that we would be there to keep things in a stable, secure situation.
But there was a further agreement at Camp David that was rarely discussed. Egypt committed itself to supplying oil to Israel.
Those accords guaranteed Israel the right to bid on oil supplies from the Sinai Peninsula. Israel had become dependent on oil imports from that area. So, as part of this agreement, they wanted to ensure that they continue to meet their energy needs using those oil fields.
These are common interests that are not particularly advertised, but they do tend to cement a relationship. But when you look at a relationship or a treaty, what you're looking at is a weave of interests. That's what sustains it. If you have an agreement to have an oil condominium, that's helpful. That's what you try and put in place, and then it's much harder to tear it apart.
The peace accords also wove together the interests of two powerful groups. Egypt's military and intelligence services began regular meetings with their Israeli counterparts. This was to have profound effects on Egypt's future.
From the 1990s onwards, the relationship between the Egyptian military and Israel was actually of almost an alliance, of close cooperation in terms of intelligence sharing.
The deal did bring certain Israelis from the intelligence services and Egyptians from the intelligence services closer together. The peace dividend that we've seen is that members of the business elite, specifically the corrupt business elite, and members of the intelligence agencies, they built lots of close relationships.
The military in Egypt are our partners in collaboration in this region. The army, the government see us as legit, which is very important, and we should encourage this.
In 1993, another historic deal was again to entangle energy policy with proposals for Middle East peace. In the Oslo Accords, the Palestine Liberation Organization recognized the State of Israel. Egypt was repaid for its role in convincing the Palestinian leadership to sign the deal. Edward Walker was the U.S. ambassador to Egypt and then Israel in the 1990s.
We were looking for the gas and the use of gas as a mechanism for tying these countries together. Whenever you have mutual interests between even two enemies and they agree on how to deal with it so they both profit, that's perfect. That's exactly what you want, because people, they like money, and money talks.
What followed next was Israeli investment in a $1.2 billion petroleum refinery in Alexandria. Established in 1994, the Middle East Oil Refinery, or MEDOR, brought together individuals from Egyptian and Israeli intelligence. Together, they masterminded a scheme to ensure the project bypassed popular opposition in Egypt. It made them very wealthy, and it was backed by both governments and the United States.
I got to know MEDOR people as they were trying to get their permission to go forward with their project. There was always some kind of particular concern about status of the project because it gave recognition to Israel in a way that many people in Egypt were not comfortable with. In other words, it gave them control over a portion of the economy when you have that kind of cooperation. But that was overcome.
That one company was run by two men who both had very close connections to the intelligence services and to ruling regimes, who were managing to extort a vast amount of wealth, basically from the Egyptian public, and that money was clearly circulating back through the elites.
It always boils down to, is it enough of an income earner to be able to cover everybody? And I think the answer is yes. And that's why it got started, and was able to overcome its political problems in the first part.
The chief architect of Egypt's energy deals with Israel is Hussein Salem. He's a former intelligence officer once convicted of fraud in the United States. He was the hidden facilitator behind the Mubarak regime.
He's walking with his minder.
Now living in exile in Spain, Salem continues to wield influence over Egypt's energy policies.
He's still coming my way. He's turning left.
Hussein Salem for me is the mysterious guy, the shadowy figure. And obviously he was very influential.
He built up relationships with Israelis and with Israeli intelligence in the 70s and 80s. He was based in the US when the negotiations over the peace deal with the Israelis were taking place.
Well, he's a engaging guy and very wealthy. He could make things happen. And so I liked him, because as an investor, I want somebody that can make things happen.
While Hussein Salem was the brains behind the MEDOR refinery project, the company's boss was Salem's protege, an engineer named Sami Fahmy. Both men would become central protagonists in the hidden story of Egypt's energy industry. Fahmy and the Israelis got on notoriously well.
Sami Fahmy is an Egyptian gentleman, undoubtedly. Very strict, very knowledgeable, excellent English, very polite, straightforward. I had good meetings with him.
Salem soon cashed out of the MEDOR project, making a bountiful profit. He arranged for his protege, Sami Fahmy, to become Egypt's petroleum minister.
The presence of Sami Fahmy as minister defines a new era of the energy sector in Egypt, where the energy resources is managed by the intelligence of Egypt.
In a confidential document obtained by Al Jazeera, the Egyptian government's investment authority promised to grant an exclusive license to sell Egypt's gas to a new company set up by Salem called EMG, or East Mediterranean gas. Sami Fahmy was the petroleum minister at the time. Salam now had his sights on a bigger and more controversial economic prize: the building of an undersea pipeline between Al Arish and Ashkelon with a single objective: to pump cheap Egyptian gas into Israel.
That was when the basic principle was established that Egypt would sell the gas to EMG. EMG would sell the gas on to the Israelis.
This agreement didn't take the approval of the parliament at that time, and instead they have allocated the gas directly to a company that has been established by the Hussein Salem and his former intelligence people as well, like him.
Partnering Salam in his newly formed company was Yossi Maimon, a former agent from Israel's foreign intelligence service, Mossad. Maimon had earlier made millions as Salam's partner on the Meteor project. In 2004, Maimon described himself to Israel's energy minister as the sole broker for selling Egypt's gas.
I never liked him for the first time I saw him. And with all due respect, a person that comes to you with a note, which he didn't show, by the way, saying that he has a note that gives him the exclusive right to be the broker of gas between Egypt and Israel, I would raise an eyebrow, and that's what I did.
Maimon then hired Shabtai Shavit, a former director of Mossad, to become a senior executive with EMG.
I understood that Shabtai Shavit was hired by Maimon in order to promote or to enhance the deal. Why him, a former Mossad chief, beats me? I don't know.
Hussein Salem and Maimon, between the two of them, had these links and networks that extended through the intelligence services and the business community, which enabled them to ensure buy-in from the key elites, from the people who needed to sign off on these deals to happen.
Both governments, in Israel and Egypt, wanted to keep the true identity and role of East Mediterranean gas hidden from view.
It was unclear to us who we were making the deal with, what are the real numbers, what's the profit, what are the costs of this deal.
It was so covert, it was so behind the scenes, it was so untransparent that it called for attention.
Despite the opposition of Israel's then energy minister, the deal went ahead with the blessing of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak and Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. Sami Fahmy, the Egyptian Minister of Petroleum, signed a memorandum of understanding with his Israeli counterpart. The memo emphasized that the supply of gas from Egypt to Israel will contribute to enhancing peace and stability in the Middle East. It allowed EMG to construct a pipeline to supply Israel with gas for at least 15 years.
It is the kind of agreement that was helping to cement the Egypt-Israel treaty. And that's why we were always very positive about it, without getting into the whole corruption side of it.
When he looked closer at the deal, Paritsky found that Israel benefited with very cheap gas.
The deal that they offered was too good to be true. Too good to be true. The prices were ridiculous. I didn't know what it was, but it was too good to be true.
The agreement included secret terms set out in the Egyptian government document from 2000. The price of Egyptian gas sold to EMG was fixed at $1.50 for each million British thermal unit, or MBTU. These fire sale prices remain unprecedented in the natural gas industry.
In the same year, gas was being exported in other countries to Japan for $12.50. Not $1.50, $12.50. In the same year, Germany was receiving pipe gas from Russia for over $8, $9, $10 per unit. So this is vastly more, up to 8 times more what the Egyptians were receiving.
The end consumer was the Israeli Electric Company, the country's primary power supplier. And at that time, it was Egyptian gas keeping the lights on in Israel's largest city, Tel Aviv.
Egypt would sell to this company with less than $2 per million BTU, where Egypt at that time were importing fuel oil to run the electricity power stations with around $9 to $10 per million BTU.
After the first year, the Israelis finally consented that, okay, they would pay more, but the Egyptians were still only getting $3. The fact that the Egyptians were now receiving 3 rather than 1.5 meant they were still being ripped off and still vastly underpricing the gas. And in fact, the Egyptians lost more money in 2010 at that higher price than they did in 2008 at the lower price because they were also exporting more gas.
Even now, the price that Israel paid for Egypt's gas is so sensitive that officials at the electric company remain unwilling to discuss it.
The deal with Egypt was very important for Israel Electric and for the state of Israel.
What was the price of the gas that Israel was buying from Egypt and the quantity?
We cannot talk about it, I'm sorry. We cannot.
You can't talk about the terms of this?
The only thing that I would tell is not the price. I'm not in a position to quote the numbers.
Wait, listen, I'm so sorry, okay?
The Egyptian state was selling the gas to EMG, dominated by 2 men, Hussein Salem and Yossi Maiman. They were receiving it from the Egyptians for $3 and then selling it on to the Israelis for 4.5 and basically pocketing the difference.
We tracked down Yossi Maiman as he arrived at his corporate headquarters north of Tel Aviv. The gated compound was once the center of a business empire worth billions. He rarely speaks in public and refused our earlier requests for an interview.
There's been a lot of money you've made off of the sale of gas below market price from Egypt.
So you say.
What was the price that you paid for Egypt's gas?
More than adequate for Egypt.
Do you think it was fair?
Yeah.
Why don't you disclose the price?
Gentlemen.
Many people feel that the gas was sold at prices that weren't fair and that the government ripped off the people. Do you have any message to the Egyptian people? Did you sell for a fair price to Israel?
Many people think it's very dangerous to swim in Australia because of both jellyfish and sharks.
With respect,
I'm no jellyfish, I'm no shark. Have a good day.
When was the last time you talked with Hussein Salem?
See you all.
What's Hussein Salem like in person?
Next question.
I don't want anything from this, from this point of view that will, somebody
Okay.
can quote us, and I don't want to get involved
All
in
right,
this.
okay.
So please, all the questions that you've asked before also, please don't take it into about the Egyptian, nothing from us, please.
The EMG deal relied on Israeli political support, as well as one more crucial link: Salem's relationship with Mubarak.
EMG had nothing but the political support of the Mubarak regime. The EMG had no assets. Before it sold even one molecule of gas, it was already estimated at over $2 billion.
When you've got a repressive, undemocratic regime that's trying to siphon off as much money as it can, then you need to find ways to do that. And that is largely the role that EMG played.
And nobody's telling stories out of school to say that people who had that kind of position with Mubarak did very well financially. One of the problems they had, ultimately.
We tracked Hussein Salem to one of the 7 mansions he owns in Spain.
Marhaba, Clayton Swisherman, Qanat Al Jazeera. How are you?
Good.
We'd like to ask you some questions.
Salem was convicted in absentia of corruption and squandering Egypt's resources. Police confiscated assets worth millions of euros from his properties in Spain. But he avoided extradition to Egypt.
Okay. What's your relation to former Mossad officer Yossi Maiman? Was he your business partner?
I don't answer any question.
Let's be respectful about this.
Call the police. I don't want interview. No.
I want to be respectful about this, Mr. Salim. Do you feel that you're above the law, that you don't owe the Egyptian people an explanation?
I don't answer.
Why don't you want to answer?
I don't answer.
You don't answer to journalists, or you don't answer to the courts?
I won't answer to you.
You don't think that you have a moral obligation to speak to your people?
Javier, por favor.
Do the Egyptian people have a right to know what you did with the country's natural gas? You think that's funny? The Egyptian people are without power, Mr. Salim, and you live quite well here in Madrid. You don't feel that you owe an explanation to the Egyptian people about what happened?
I will not answer.
Mika Minio Paluelo analyzes energy prices for a London-based think tank. He has worked out how much the EMG deal has cost the Egyptian people. Using prices from the same confidential documents obtained by Al Jazeera, he made a calculation based on each year the pipeline was operating.
In 2008, when the gas first started being pumped, the Israelis and EMG were paying the Egyptians $1.50 per unit. And this meant that in 2008, the Egyptians took in under $100 million for the gas they exported through that pipeline. Now, at that same point in time, the Japanese were paying over $12.6 per unit of gas. Egypt could have exported gas there instead, and instead of taking in less than $100 million, it could have taken in $770 million.
Mika then worked out how much in total Egyptian taxpayers had subsidized Israeli consumers over the 3 years that the pipeline was operating.
My calculations show that Egypt lost $1.8 billion through this deal. Egypt could have made $1.8 billion more dollars by using the gas in other ways.
Mika also calculated the total revenue that the Egyptian people have lost from deals its government made via Hussein Salem and his Israeli associates. This includes contracts exporting gas to other countries, as well as Israel.
That adds up to a total loss to the Egyptian people of possibly over $11 billion. Almost all of these involved Hussein Salem at some point in time in arranging the deals.
What do you have to say to your people? Do you feel ashamed that you've been convicted of stealing the country's natural resources?
No answer.
Are you guilty of those crimes?
No answer.
No, that's not a yes or a no. You're saying...
No answer.
You're not saying you're guilty or not guilty?
No answer.
Finally, Mika estimated the personal wealth that Hussein Salem made from the EMG deal. Even before any gas was sold, he had turned a $300 million investment into a windfall.
During the same period that the pipeline was built, he sold 37% of his holding. Sold one chunk for $2 billion and the other chunk for $2.2 billion. So that's $4.2 billion that Hussein Salem made before the gas had really even started pumping. He'd made an investment of $300 million and taken in $4.2 billion.
Did you steal your country's natural resources?
No.
No?
In part 2, how EMG shareholders now hope to reverse the pumps on their pipeline and sell Israeli gas to Egypt.
Did you steal your country's natural resources?
No.